Great to see everyone. I don't need to introduce Rabbi Evan, but he's going to introduce our speaker. We'll be taking questions at the end. Today is Tuesday, June 30th. July 4th is coming up, and I can't wait to hear what Yonatan is going to tell us. So, with no further ado, Rabbi Evan, go ahead.
Well, this was a sort of last minute idea I had because I have a very good friend who uh, is a real, scholar in American history and a great teacher, and also married to a rabbi, so knows the Jewish community. Is family originally from Israel, so I just thought a great opportunity to learn for the July 4th because we're going to hear so many things. And a lot of us, we'll have a great time, fireworks, parties. It's great. But there's also some real extraordinary history. And I know our congregation loves to learn as I do. And I thought, what a great opportunity to have my friend Yonatan Eyal. And we're going to learn from him. So he can tell you a little bit more about his qualifications, but suffice it to say, they're extraordinary. We met when we were at Stanford and as undergraduates, and then Yonatan went on to get his PhD in American history at Harvard with someone who eventually became the president of Harvard, Drew Faust, and has lived in a couple different places and now lives in Concord, Mass. And his wife, Karen, who is a good friend of my wife, is the rabbi of the big Reform Synagogue in Lexington, Massachusetts, which is right next door. And so we're just delighted to have you here, Yonatan. And I know my congregants are just really lucky to learn from you.
Thanks, Evan.
Yes.
Thanks for being here.
Yeah.
It's fantastic to see you all as we gear up for the July 4th weekend. As Evan said, I know him from being roommates together as undergrads at Stanford. And he used to visit me in my Cambridge years, including a trip right to where I sit right now here in Concord, Massachusetts, that he might remember from Cambridge.
Yes.
During that time, never knowing I would actually live here. After I graduated, I became a professor of U.S. history at University of Toronto. So I taught U.S. history in Canada and really adjusted the curriculum internationally, which is a whole separate conversation I'm always happy to talk about. I was following my wife, Karen, as Evan said, who is a rabbi. We eventually moved back to Cincinnati, and I became an administrator in higher ed and have followed more the administrative path since then. But I've always taught one course a year since then, thinking it's really healthy to do the kind of thing you are trying to manage, basically. I should also say I'm not a revolutionary historian. That's not my specialization in American history. My specialization, as you heard Evan talking about Drew Faust, is actually Civil War, 19th century. However, I've always believed that anybody should be able to teach, if they're specialists in American history, any period of American history, regardless of what their actual research specialization is in. And during my Toronto years, I was asked to teach the American Revolution class and spent a lot of time designing it for an international audience, really asking what about the colonies that didn't join the rebellion, like Nova Scotia and Jamaica and Barbados, as opposed to the ones that did, like Massachusetts and Virginia. And so because of that experience, I spent a lot of time on the Revolution, eventually brought my American Revolution class back stateside when we moved to Cincinnati and continued teaching that. And so it's on that basis that I'm speaking, even though it's not my actual research specialization, which is farther ahead in the 19th century. Two other preliminaries before we get started. As we gear up here for the July 4th weekend and the 250th, it's really picture perfect, I just realized, to come to you, as Evan said, from our home here in Concord, Massachusetts, right? Ground zero for it all. Although I will say that our big moment and all the hoopla here happened a year and a half ago on April 19th, 2025, the 250th anniversary of the battle. So things are pretty quiet here right now. We don't really do much of anything here in Concord for July 4th. It's April 19th that is the big day. So we don't have all the big events on July 4th. We leave that to the rest of the country. It's April 19th if you want to come here to Lexington and Concord, where everything happens. So it's really interesting how that is the case and how muted it is, in fact, right now. Lastly, I will say before launching into this that I think hanging over this is, as you might have heard, the really distressing and untimely death of the great revolutionary historian Gordon Wood from Brown. He was hit by a car in a parking lot in Providence, Rhode Island, just a few weeks ago at the age of 94. And I'm just struck by how pretty much how everything we're going to be talking about today is a conversation we could not be having without his work, starting with his first book in 1969 and going through his Pulitzer Prize-winning work in the 1990s and onward since then. So it's obviously a tragedy and just kind of shocking, that there we go, that he died just so suddenly here. And so everything we're going to be talking about really comes from Gordon Wood's scholarship. He set the parameters for the kind of conversation. So here's what I'm going to be doing, maybe about 40 minutes, and hopefully leave some time for questions and discussions. It occurred to me that we spend so much time now commemorating the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence and the birthplace of this republic. But what are we actually celebrating beyond simple persistence? Is it simply that we made it this far? I guess that's a good enough reason to celebrate, certainly. But I think there are some more foundational principles or philosophies that come out of our country that people may not realize, may not take enough sort of pride in or wallow in enough, that are the things we are actually commemorating. And I think this realization comes from my years teaching U.S. history outside the United States and really trying to home in on what are the distinctive contributions to political theory, philosophy, governance that came out of our revolution that are different from the rest of the world. So that's where this came from. And the contributions I'm going to be discussing today basically come from the last lecture day of my course on the American Revolution, where I always try to distill for students, okay, so what does this all mean? What really is the revolution all about? Why actually are we celebrating it? And by extension for today, why are we celebrating the 250th? What are the really central contributions? And so I have four sort of basic principles, and they involve names that you will recognize because they're words that we bandy about in American political culture every single day. But I'm not sure we're speaking about the same things when we're talking about them. So I'm going to go through each of these four and explain why I think each of these principles or philosophies or innovations that I'll be talking about are the things we're actually celebrating now at the 250th anniversary. It's great to have a birthday party for the nation. It's great to celebrate our persistence. And God knows nations don't often persist that long. And God knows it would be great if we kept persisting that long. But what substantively are we actually celebrating? So here are my four. Again, the words will be familiar to you, but I hope that the discussion of them will be a little less familiar to you, perhaps depending on your background. Number one, federalism. Talk about it a lot. Number two, constitutionalism. Number three, republicanism with a lowercase r, meaning the idea of a republic. And then finally, Enlightenment gradualism, which I will explain, or Enlightenment moderation, which is a principle associated with the late 18th century that we'll get to at the close of my talk. So those are my four: federalism, constitutionalism, republicanism, and gradualism. Again, in my view, these are the four big principles or philosophies or contributions to governance that came out of our founding moment, out of the American Revolution. And these are the things that I believe we're actually celebrating here at the 250th. And I don't think we spend enough time really unpacking what they mean, how distinctive they are as contributions to the world from the American founding moment, from the late 18th century. So the first one is federalism. And it's a word we use a lot, but we don't often define it. The definition is deceptively simple. It's a system of government in which we divide sovereignty or supreme authority across different layers of government based on subject matter or policy. So let's backtrack a little bit to make sure we're all on the same page. So sovereignty, another word we encounter often in political theory, means power that knows no power above itself. It means supreme authority or supremacy. There's nothing above sovereignty. If there is, then it's not sovereign. Sovereignty, political theory conventionally had suggested up until the late 1700s, could not be divided. There's only one entity in governance that could hold sovereignty, because by definition, somebody, some entity has to be supreme. Maybe it's a monarch, maybe it's a prince, maybe it's a legislative body, maybe it's some other kind of government, but sovereignty or supreme authority or supremacy has to reside somewhere. It has to repose somewhere. It can't be divvied up, because by definition, then it's no longer sovereign. If you have more than one entity, more than one type of government, then how are you actually exercising supremacy? It's a recipe for anarchy, as the two sides or three sides or four different layers of government sort of duke it out. But the great innovation of the American experience in the founding moment, particularly in the 1780s, the Constitution writing decade, was to say, yes, we can divide up sovereignty. Yes, we can split up this supremacy across different layers of government so that one layer of government, say the state government, is supreme in one subject matter or policy area, and another layer of government, say the national government in what became Washington, is supreme in another subject matter or policy area, like, say, foreign affairs or commerce among the states, interstate commerce. We can actually divvy it up and we can have supremacy not exist in one particular place. And the idea was that this is particularly healthy because if you divvy up sovereignty, you prevent the consolidation of power in one place, in one kind of government, national, say, or local, which leads to abuse. That was one of the key lessons of the American Revolution. What leads to abuse is any kind of concentration of power, and the word they used is consolidation. If you consolidate power in one place. And so what you want to do is take that most supreme kind of power that we call sovereignty, and divvy it up across different layers of government based on subject matter or based on policy. So that one layer of government, like a state government, could be considered sovereign, say, in education policy, or in its police power is another reserved power that the states have that supposedly they're sovereign in. And another layer of government, like the national government, is supreme or sovereign in another policy area or subject matter, like foreign affairs. As the former not chief, but Justice Antonin Scalia used to say, James Madison split the atom of sovereignty at the Philadelphia Convention of 1787. So that's one way of looking at it, is divided sovereignty. There are a few different formulations of the word federalism that we could get into. For example, one of the delegates at the Philadelphia Convention, James Wilson, formulated it a little bit differently. He said that it's the people who ultimately retain sovereignty. In America, popular sovereignty is our form of government, so the only sovereigns are the people, and what the people actually do is they delegate certain aspects of that sovereignty to this layer of government or that layer of government. So that is another formulation that was more acceptable to certain factions in the 1780s, particularly the anti-federalists who initially opposed the Philadelphia Constitution of 1787, to put it that way, to say that the only sovereigns are the people, popular sovereignty, the sovereignty or supreme authority of the people, but the people may choose to delegate supremacy over foreign affairs, say, to the national government, over education, say, or the police power to the state government. That's another way of looking at it. But divided sovereignty is sort of the general way in which we think of federalism. Despite Justice Scalia's comment, federalism did not emerge fully formed at the Philadelphia Convention of 1787. It didn't just come out Zeus-like from James Madison's mind. There is a history to the concept and the practice, like there is a history to everything. We won't be able to get into that today, but suffice it to say there are lots of precedents, including in the American colonial era before the Revolution, for dividing supreme authority in this way, saying this layer of government is responsible for this policy area, this layer of government is responsible for that policy area. And if you're interested in the history of federalism rather than its sort of monumental deployment in the 1780s in the Philadelphia Convention, I happily refer you to the book by my good grad school friend and colleague Allison LaCroix, who now teaches where you are at the University of Chicago Law School. Her first book was The Ideological Origins of American Federalism. And the whole premise of the book is federalism as a practice has a history before 1787, and she takes it back into the American colonial era, going back into, say, the founding of New England in the 1630s and 1640s. So that book enumerates all the precedents to federalism. But here's one key contribution that we are really celebrating, this idea, very far from conventional political philosophy of the time, that supremacy or supreme authority can in fact be divided up. It doesn't have to stay consolidated in one place. The general line at the time that people like Madison grew up was imperio in imperium is a solecism. So imperio in imperium, a power within a power, is a logical fallacy. It can't exist because sovereignty is a particular kind of power. It's supremacy. It's different than other delegations of power. And so by definition, it has to repose, it has to come to rest in one place, because it's simply illogical to have supremacy in more than one place, because who is going to decide what is supreme ultimately? Right? And so really revolting against that idea and saying that you can divide it after all is kind of an amazing innovation. Obviously, even with federalism, even with divided sovereignty, there are going to be clashes. Inevitably, there will. And the way our political system has emerged, it is the federal judiciary that has become the arbiter of clashes having to do with federalism. Does the state government really have sovereignty over this policy area that it claims? Does the national regime in Washington truly have sovereignty over this area that it claims? The judicial branch at the federal level, the Supreme Court, has come to be the arbiter of that. That wasn't necessarily how it was intended. Allison, in her book, goes through some other options considered at the time, besides the judicial branch, for arbitrating any existing residual disputes over divided sovereignty, over federalism. It didn't have to be the judiciary. And there's certainly a lot of work going on right now on the part of law professors arguing that the judicial branch was never intended to be really the exclusive or even primary arbiter of constitutionality. There's a forthcoming book by two Harvard law professors, for example, that argued that the questions of constitutionality, what is constitutional or not, were never intended to be in the hands of the Supreme Court. They were intended to be in the hands of other branches of our national government. So the idea of who arbitrates federalism is certainly a live debate. Federalism spread beyond the United States. Other countries have adopted it, though not too many. You can certainly see it in Canada, where I taught, as I said, back in Toronto with its system of provinces. They deploy a federalism. They did so upon Canadian Confederation, this moment when they got autonomy from the British Empire in 1867. So they certainly use sovereignty. You can see it in some other parts of the world, like the federated Swiss cantons, these sort of Swiss jurisdictions that exist with divided sovereignty. So it is in play elsewhere in the world. And the demonstration of its utility and its availability and arguably its success comes from the United States. It's worth noting that not every part of the world, every government that has multiple departments or layers necessarily is using federalism. So when you have, say, different layers of government in France, that doesn't mean federalism is in play. The real question you have to ask is, does some other layer of government have to follow the national layer of government, or are they truly free, truly independent? Do they truly have sovereignty to make their own decisions, or must they follow the national regime? That's how you know federalism is in play, when a lower level of government, such as a state or some local jurisdiction, is able to say, we're doing X, even though the national regime opposes it, because we have sovereignty or supremacy in this particular policy area. So you can see it around the world, but not necessarily everywhere. So that's one contribution. So we'll leave federalism there, thumbnail sketch. Moving on to my second of the four, constitutionalism here, very briskly in the time we have available. Another great contribution of the American founding that we really should be self-consciously celebrating at the 250th. The idea of a constitution is having a fundamental written law apart from ordinary or everyday or statutory law. So idea of a fundamental law is something that stands apart from ordinary lawmaking. So for example, if ordinary everyday lawmaking or making of statutes happens on the part of a legislature like a parliament or a state legislature or a Congress, a fundamental law is something sort of antecedent to that. It's before that, it's outside of that. It's something that checks the legislature or the parliament or the Congress. This seems pretty obvious to us today because we're Americans. It's certainly not obvious in other parts of the world, and it was certainly not obvious before the Constitution writing of Americans began during wartime in the 1770s. In the British system, even to this day, there is no written fundamental law that checks the Parliament. Parliamentary sovereignty, right? The supremacy of Parliament is the order of the day. Parliament can legislate statutorily on pretty much whatever it wants. There are no restrictions. And in fact, the very word constitution means something different outside of the United States. Even to this day, in the British context, the word constitution does not refer to a written fundamental law that checks the legislators. Rather, it refers to the accumulated precedents and understandings and traditions that have emerged through the common law and other precedents over time, and that themselves constrain what legislators can do. But it is custom and precedent. It is not a written law. There was a movement in the 19th century to create an American-style written constitution for England called Chartism. So if you've heard of the Chartist movement in the 19th century, in the reign of Queen Victoria, for example, that was an unsuccessful movement to sort of Americanize a fundamental law in England, but it didn't succeed. And so we changed the meaning of the word constitution to refer to something written and something fundamental, something that stands outside of the everyday law, something against which you can check the actions of legislators. The reason our founders created such a system is because of one of the key lessons they learned from the revolution. That lesson is that even a legislative branch, supposedly representative of the people, can in fact become abusive. In the English case, they had already learned the lesson that a king or queen can become abusive. That's why they executed their king, Charles I, in 1649. That's why they drove another king from the throne, James II, in the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688. The British had already learned the lesson that monarchy can be abusive. But the lesson they didn't yet learn, the extra step that Americans took, is that Parliament can also be abusive, that the representatives of the people also need a check on them, and that check on the legislature, on the representatives of the people, is a fundamental written law, something you write down that stands outside of and external to a parliament or a Congress or a legislature. That's the extra step of the 1770s and 1780s that builds on those initial anti-monarchical steps of the 1640s and the 1680s in England. And so, having learned the lesson that it's not just a king who could become tyrannical, it is also the MPs, it is also the House of Commons who passed Sugar Acts and Stamp Acts and Townshend Duties and Tea Acts and Intolerable Acts and all those horrible things that we know as the chain of events leading to the revolution. It's the Parliament itself that can become abusive, and by extension, the American Congress itself that can become abusive. And so, we need a fundamental law apart from that that says what a Parliament or Congress actually can do. There are two important components to this piece that are worth separating out. The first is the very idea of a fundamental law, different from ordinary or everyday law. As I've suggested, in the European case, parliaments are usually supreme. They do not have something checking them apart from whatever it is they decide to legislate on. So a law that stands apart from a parliament or legislature, right? A fundamental law, in other words, sometimes known as the people out of doors. That's the way it's sometimes described in the literature of political philosophy. The people indoors would be the people being represented in a parliament or Congress or legislature, and the people out of doors, so to speak, would be the people represented in this other way through a constitution. If you're looking for an equivalent body to represent the people out of doors vis-a-vis the people indoors, the equivalent body to a parliament or legislature would be a constitutional convention, or in the case of our Philadelphia Constitution, the ratifying conventions that existed state by state in 1788 and 89 to ratify the Constitution. Those ratifying conventions in which each state said, yes, we'll sign on to this new Philadelphia Constitution, America's second constitution after the Articles of Confederation, those ratifying conventions were really, in the American experience, the most direct instantiation, the most direct deployment of the people's will, of popular sovereignty, before you ever get to a Congress, right, or a legislature, because they're the people saying, yes, we want this fundamental frame of government called the Constitution, and then later on we'll elect representatives under that framework, under the framework of that Constitution to a Congress, let's say, right? So the ratifying conventions, the Constitutional Convention itself in Philadelphia, these are sort of deployments of popular sovereignty that are represented in its more elemental form and its more basic form before you get to a legislature. And in the American experience, even though we haven't ever called another constitutional convention since 1787, we've only revised the Constitution 27 times through that other mechanism that exists. Nevertheless, in our imagination, there always exists this idea that we can sort of return to the founding moment, return to the ground zero of a constitutional convention. That mechanism does exist in our Philadelphia Constitution, even though we've never actually used it. We can return to that sort of founding moment, the people out of doors, the people creating a fundamental law. And again, all you have to do is really sort of teach and live outside the United States, as I did, to realize how unusual this is compared to other countries. Certainly, other countries have adopted the idea of a fundamental law, something to check their people's representatives. Some have even committed it to paper, written it down like we have. But it is a great innovation of the Constitution writing era of the 1770s and 1780s that was exported to other countries, but not to other countries universally by any means, and certainly England, for example, to this day, is still subject to that doctrine from the 1600s, the doctrine of parliamentary sovereignty. Whatever parliament legislates is sovereign within the empire, and the question of our founders toward the British Parliament still remains to this day. So what is there to check the MPs in Parliament? Our founders' answer is a piece of parchment or paper that exists before, antecedent to, outside of those bodies against which the legislators can be checked, ultimately recalled, and at least hypothetically called to account. So that's the second one that I always tell students we are really sort of commemorating when we think of the American Revolution, the other great innovation alongside federalism that was deployed in the 1770s and 1780s here and eventually in certain places around the world. The third of my four abstract principles or concepts or ideas or innovations that came out of the 1770s and 80s that we really should be commemorating at this 250th is that word republicanism that I mentioned at the beginning. Again, these are words we hear all the time, but we scarcely bother to define them most of the time. In this case, republicanism, again, has nothing to do with the Republican Party of today, which is the party that emerged in the 1850s, in the era that I actually study in my research specialty. It's really the idea of a republic with a lowercase r. And the idea of a republic at its most basic definition is a form of government based on popular sovereignty. Form of government in which the people are supreme as opposed to a king or an aristocracy or an oligarchy or some kind of monarchy, really just a system of government in which the people rule. But that basic definition doesn't carry us far enough because over time that word republic has come to have additional connotations which are even more resonant for the American experience. The most important of these extra meanings or connotations that the word republic picked up is representation. And here again, we're really going right into the work of the late Gordon Wood. So a republic was seen to be a deployment of a government based on popular sovereignty, the supreme will of the people, in a particular way. Not directly, as in that word democracy or direct democracy, right? Athenian democracy, the ancient Greek city-states, direct democracy, not through that, but through the mechanism of representation. And over time, that kind of came to be perceived to be the difference between a republic and a democracy is that in a republic, you still have popular sovereignty, you still have the supreme will of the people, but you are exercising that through representation, right? Through a legislature, through people electing representatives rather than directly. The most important reason for that refinement in what that means has to do with something that Madison talked about in the Federalist Number 10, the most famous of the Federalist Papers, the key commentary on the Constitution written by Madison, John Jay, and Alexander Hamilton in 1788 to 89, the ratification struggle. And what Hamilton talks about in Federalist Number 10 is geographic territory, geographic expansion, the extent both at the time and anticipatorily in the future of the American Republic. Again, the conventional political wisdom, the conventional legal wisdom of the time is that you can have a free government, you can have popular sovereignty, but only in circumscribed locales, only in places like city-states, right? Like the ancient Greek city-states of Athens and Sparta, for example, that when you attempt to expand the geographic territory, you really can't have the people ruling themselves. And when it comes to direct democracy, that is no doubt the case. It becomes very cumbersome for people spread out over a large territory as their population mushrooms to have enough knowledge of candidates and issues to really have a meaningful say in governing themselves. And so what you need if you have an expansive geography like this inchoate, this budding United States did, is really a system of representation in which the people could still rule, but do so indirectly through their representatives. The American founders like to say that they were bringing back the idea of a republic for the first time in almost 2,000 years, since the Roman Republic had collapsed in the first century before the Common Era and given way to the Roman Empire. That's largely true, although, as some of you will know, there were republics that existed between that time, between the collapse of the Roman Empire and the creation of the American Republic in 1776. Certainly city-states like Venice and Florence, the Dutch Republic, there are certain examples of this, but what they all have in common is that, again, they are geographically limited. They are city-states, right? And so it became very customary in the 18th century, during our constitution writing era, to assume that you could have popular sovereignty, you could have a republic, but it has to be done in a very circumscribed geography. When you attempt to expand, you have a big territory, it's not going to work, and so you need an empire, hence the British Empire. British Empire had a little bit of republicanism into it, the House of Commons, but it also had a little bit of aristocracy in it, the House of Lords, and a good deal of monarchy in it as well. This was called the mixed or balanced British Constitution. The idea that you could have 100% republicanism, or 100% people governing themselves over an expansive territory and not degenerate into an imperial, dictatorial, monarchical, aristocratic form of government was a pretty bold innovation. And the mechanism of representation was the way in which Madison described in the Federalist Number 10, the way in which it could be done. Because if you have representation, then you can expand and you can maintain free government as your territory grows. Incidentally, federalism was another quiver in the arsenal, in the toolkit of an expansive republic, right? Because just as you could have representatives and therefore maintain the people's rule as your geography expands, so by the same token, federalism, allowing some sovereignty at the local level, right, at certain matters, would keep a society free even while your geography expands. So notice how these two tools of republicanism, the idea of a republic, and also federalism kind of work hand in hand in allowing free government to exist in what Madison called an extended republic. And so here, Madison, the author of our Constitution, was answering really the question of European political philosophy that said you can't really have people governing themselves over a large swath of territory. Madison, along with particularly Benjamin Franklin, gave a lot of thought to what the boundaries of the United States would look like in the future. Thanks to the Paris Peace Treaty with Britain in 1783, they were already stretching to the Mississippi, and it was understood they would become continental as they did in the 19th century in the era of James K. Polk. And so the question was, could we remain a republic rather than an empire? Obviously, we became an empire in other ways in terms of conquest of indigenous populations, the expansion of the inland southern slave empire into the Southwest, and all those other kinds of things. But at least as far as the actual form of government was concerned, would it have to be a monarchy, for example, or could it remain a republic? The idea was we would be safe. We would avoid the fate of Europe. We would remain a republic because of these mechanisms of republicanism and federalism. And it's at this point that I usually say to the students in my American Revolution class, I kind of step away from the podium to signal to them that I'm about to say something important. I step away from my notes and I say, this is the moment where we're going to ditch the sort of third grade version of civics that you learned, in which we say our country is a democracy. And now, from this point on, we're going to say our country is a federal republic. And by this point, I tell the students, hopefully you understand exactly what those two words mean, federal and republic, because we've discussed federalism and we've discussed republicanism. And so that's a much more precise definition of the kind of government that we're supposed to have, a federal republic. An interesting local twist that I'll digress into just for a moment before wrapping up with the fourth category of gradualism. Here where I sit in Concord, Massachusetts, and in all the New England towns, the towns are governed by a town meeting. For years, I used to stand up at the lectern and talk about the New England town hall style of governance, and sure enough, it is alive and well. Town meeting meets every single year in the spring to vote on town business. But there are different versions of a town meeting. The one we have here in Concord, which remains a town of 18,000 inhabitants, much bigger than the about 2,500 it was at the time of the battle on April 19th, 1775, is a town government of direct democracy. Every resident of Concord can go to town meeting, which takes several nights in April, and vote on town business, which then becomes law. So it's direct democracy, and the whole idea is direct democracy can work because the town is small enough, although it is bursting at the seams now with 18,000. Next door, the other battle town, where my wife Karen is the senior rabbi, as Evan mentioned, the town of Lexington, the first battle, they too have town meeting, of course, but their town meeting is representative. You can't just go to town meeting in Lexington just because you live there like you can here in Concord. Rather, you have to be elected to town meeting. And so when you go to Lexington, people will say, I'm on town meeting, meaning I ran and I won election to the town meeting, and then I go as a representative when it meets every spring. Why the difference? Lexington's population right now is about double that of Concord's. At a certain point, they switched, and it was perceived that you could not have self-governing in that direct way because the population got too large. And so you reverted to that principle of representation. And so I just offer that example of the difference between Concord and Lexington's town meeting to demonstrate this philosophy of the 18th century that self-government was really perceived to be tied to the scale of your population and to the scale of your geography. And as you got bigger, both geographically and demographically, it was perceived to be increasingly problematic to maintain a society based on the supreme will of the people, based on popular sovereignty, and how the principle of representation offered a way out of this for thinkers of America's Constitution writing generation. And this is sort of the crux really of Gordon Wood's books of how representation changed. What is the meaning of representation? What is a representative meant to do on behalf of the people? Because how does a representative not themselves become corrupt, right? How does a representative not become like the MPs in Parliament who then legislated a Stamp Act and a Sugar Act, right? And that's where you get a fundamental law to check them, right? That's where you get a constitution coming in. So republicanism. Lastly, in the time remaining, let me end on my fourth principle or idea that I think we really are commemorating at this 250th, and that is the idea of Enlightenment gradualism or incrementalism. There are lots of ways to effect social change. There are lots of ways to protest, and throughout American history, there have been different ways of doing it in different generations. For example, in the period that I specialize in, the 19th century, we talk about romantic reform with a capital R. In other words, the way in which you do reform in that era was by tugging at the heartstrings. Romanticism is an aesthetic and a philosophy that emerges in the 19th century in reaction to the Enlightenment that is based on the heart, that is based on intuition, that is based on how you feel, rather than in the 18th century, the era of the Enlightenment, on how you reason or on how you think. So romantic reform is one way to do social change. When we get to the progressive era in the 20th century, we formulate other ways of pursuing social change by looking at science, for example, right? Science became a big way, technocracy, of how you implement reform in the government. Well, in the late 18th century, the era in which this country was created, the Enlightenment was still holding sway. And one of the key values of that kind of reform, of the Enlightenment, one of the key principles was symmetry and order and gradualism, no sudden moves. It really is the opposite of what Romanticism would become in the late 19th century. And there's so many examples of this. You can sort of see this architecturally in neoclassical buildings, right? Order, symmetry. If you go to visit Monticello, you can see the order and the symmetry of Jefferson's mind, right? Everything is supposed to be balanced. Everything is supposed to be carefully designed and master planned. And indeed, our country, classic Enlightenment, was designed and master planned, right? Very different than what happens in my period in the Victorian era of the 19th century, where you get to Romanticism, the heart against the brain. But in the late 18th century, it's the brain, right? It's order, it's careful thinking, sort of micro changes that will have a big effect later on. It's doing things gradually without any sudden moves. Our revolution did that. By some people's lights, it doesn't even count as a revolution. A lot of students and critics will say, is the American Revolution really even a revolution? Weren't the people at the top before the revolution also the people still at the top at the end? Wasn't the top echelon of colonial society, the Washingtons and the Carters and the Patrick Henrys and the James Madisons before, and wasn't it also after? What was really revolving around it? Who was executed? Who was expelled? Who was demoted from the top, right? If you look at real revolutions, these critics say, like the French later on in 1789, or other French ones, say in 1830 or 1848, or the Russian in 1917. These are real revolutions. People are killed. The aristocracy is destroyed. New names for things are put in place. Those at the bottom of society are going to be at the top. Dictatorship of the proletariat doesn't exactly work that way, obviously, but that is at least is the theory. What have we got? They say in the 1770s and 1780s. In Karl Marx's language, when he was writing in the 1840s, we have a bourgeois revolution. We have a revolution of business people, of capitalists, right? We don't have a revolution of workers and proletarians. We don't have a slave revolt like exists in Haiti in 1791. We have a revolution of property owners, basically. After all, what are Washington and Madison and John Adams? They're sort of wealthy property owners, and they're at the top before the revolution, and they're at the at the top after. And so in Marxist typology, it's an incomplete revolution. It's only the first stage of a real revolution. It's only the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class, beginning its revolt against the British aristocracy, but it awaits its completion when the proletariat, the workers, really take control and overthrow the capitalist class. The next step has to be getting rid of the John Adamses and the George Washingtons and the Benjamin Franklins, right? Who could be more bourgeois, after all, than Benjamin Franklin, right? And so gradualism. Does our revolution not mean anything because it was so carefully orchestrated in someone's study using political texts and philosophies? The Canadians loved asking me this question, usually with a twinkle in their eye. And my answer to them would be, I understand your point logically, of course, but the record empirically would suggest that the results of this bourgeois revolution, or this very gradual revolution, or this very moderate revolution, lasted a lot longer than other revolutions that were far more radical. You'd be hard pressed. Well, you couldn't really name another government besides the United States that is still in operation today, besides the British government, for this long. And I used to challenge students to do this. I brought them a map. I said, let's go through the world. Let's go through the Chinese Revolution against the monarchy in 1911. Let's go through the Japanese Meiji Restoration of 1868. Let's go through the end of Franz Josef and the Habsburgs in 1918, the German Kaiser in 1918, the Russian Revolution and the Tsar in 1917. In France, too many revolutions to mention, it seems like every day. What about the various Italian states? What about the Middle East, the end of the Ottoman Empire around the time of World War I? And we go through the world and I say to them, okay, besides Great Britain, what other government do you have that still exists since that time, that has lasted so long? And so the empirical evidence really is stunning. And one of the questions I ask students to think about is its longevity related to its moderation? In other words, you can have a revolution with a guillotine, but do those revolutions last? You can execute the entire aristocracy at the Place de la Concorde in Paris in 1792 and 93. But then do you get Napoleon, and what happens after that? You can shoot the Tsar in the forest. We've seen that. We could go around the world. But is the moderation sort of a key? The Marxist incomplete revolution, right? A bourgeois revolution, a revolution of capitalists rather than of slaves and workers. Is that the key to its longevity? Is the moderation, is the master plannedness of it all somehow the key to its empirical success, its success over time? And that's something to think about. Obviously, the country has faced many challenges and continues to this day, and it remains an open question in our current moment whether it will exist, and even if it still exists, in what form will it actually exist? Even if it exists in terms of forms and institutions, will it actually exist in terms of substance, in terms of spirit? Remains an open question to this day. Nevertheless, it's worth noting as we commemorate the 250th that here is indeed a record of persistence since 1776, unknown the world over besides Great Britain. And that is something to be proud of, this 250th anniversary, with all our troubles, because lasting, right, as a free government is a pretty hard thing to do, right? If you really look at governments around the world, they just don't last that long. Regimes come and go. And so to have it last this long, particularly when it was tested and severed for 4 years between 1861 and 1865, is a pretty remarkable thing. And so if we are celebrating persistence and longevity this 250th, I think that's an important one to think about. And I would just ask people to think about whether gradualism is the key to that. Today we hear a lot of voices angling for things other than gradualism. We have a lot of strident voices today. We have a lot of screaming. We have a lot of yelling. The voices that we see today are not the hushed voices in the libraries and studies of Monticello or Montpelier, James Madison's estate. And yet our country was founded in the hushed voices of Montpelier and Monticello. Yes, with enslaved people making that possible by working outside. We know that today, obviously. But that is the spirit in which it was created. We are an Enlightenment nation, and a key value of the Enlightenment is reason, order, moderation, thinking things through. So where do we stand in that regard? And if that is a key to understanding the revolutionary legacy, then where does that put us today? And so I will leave you with that question. And I will just sum up that these four principles are my particular distillation of what 1776 to 1787 is really all about, what we actually are celebrating when we say 250th. It's these particular principles that are uniquely American. They certainly draw from other currents around the world. No principle, as I said, emerges just full blown out of James Madison's head. He has to read a lot from thinkers around the world to get there. So I don't mean to be parochial, to be suggesting some kind of notion of American exceptionalism. But these are things that are distinctively American and have been adopted by people elsewhere around the world. Federalism, constitutionalism, republicanism, and Enlightenment gradualism. And I hope we can keep those in mind as we celebrate the 250th. So thank you for going with me briskly through this journey in intellectual history. And I know we have 13 minutes or so for questions and discussion, so I'm certainly eager to
Yonatan, this is so fantastic. And what you really gave us such a great framework for seeing this, because I think so often we're caught up in the day-to-day controversy. We are worried about this and that, what's happening right now, the front page, the urgent. And what a historian has to do, what you just did, is help us, go back and actually look at sort of what are the foundations, what makes this unique country, tradition, history possible. And you gave it to us in such a almost like a first principles way, a unique way of understanding it. And I just want to say something. This isn't really a question, but it's more, it could be a question, but I don't think there's really an answer. I happen to think historically, there are certain moments in time when possibilities open for a brief period, and if you miss that moment, the possibilities close. Kind of like if you think about Israel in 1948, there was this possibility of a moment. It was shortly after the Holocaust, the beginning of the United Nations. There was the Cold War was just starting, but it hadn't really started. So Israel was still kind of up for play. So you kind of had to seize the moment. And in some ways, I think those 12 years between the revolution and the Constitutional Convention, what was happening historically, intellectually, in Europe, in America, technologically, it almost sort of in the air were these ideas, and it happened to be the people around at that moment could align around these ideas. And I think you helped us with that word distill, really get to what they actually did. They took a lot of these intellectual currents and distilled it into this extraordinary form of government. So obviously I could ask a zillion questions, but I want to give my congregants, members, people who I know just really learned a lot, if there are any questions.
And Evan, let me just respond to what you
Yeah.
said. Yes, absolutely. This sort of moment when opportunity knocks is rare. And one such moment was in the 1770s and 80s. And for anyone interested in that, Gordon Wood's mentor here at Harvard, Bernard Bailyn, who died not too long ago as well, wrote about sort of the unique intellectual climate of the period after the Seven Years' War ended in 1763. These people were very well versed in English political philosophy. They were sort of dyed in the wool in their English radicalism. They're just the right sort of mental configuration to be innovative enough, but also constrained by tradition to be gradualists, as we've discussed. So it was an incredible sort of window
Right.
when opportunity knocks on the window, so to speak. Exactly.
Thank you.
And
I want to give my
go ahead.
congregants, if anyone has, I know Yonatan is a historian and talked about history, but I know a lot of us are thinking about things that are happening right now. And there are so many interesting parallels. And we are in a time where we can think those big questions. So if anyone has questions, feel free to ask.
I know there are
So
some in the
if you
chat.
look in
Good.
the
Okay.
Yeah.
chat, there's a lot of things going on here. Thank you
Okay.
for
Why
your
don't we read?
optimism. I'm finding it very hard to feel celebratory when our country is in the toilet. And Bob said, in the toilet because the four principles are being systematically taken apart. But Michael said, I wonder if the balance of empirism and romanticism has currently shifted to romanticism, where belief supersedes truth. Very interesting. So, what has the romantic track record over time?
Yes, so
What
let
is?
me address some of those. So the first two, the optimism. It's interesting you say that. Uh, Elaine and Bob, because I was just giving another lecture from my wife's temple. I guess that's what I do now is I talk at temples. They had this series where you go into people's homes and someone hosts a dinner for about 10 congregants and then they have a talk. And so it wasn't this talk. It was about my own field in the 19th century. It was about the history of
I can
America.
see you're giving my congregants some good ideas. I
There
already
you
saw
go.
a couple of heads nodding.
It was about the history of America's two-party system and the persistence of the two-party system. And what I was trying to say is, my God, look at the two-party system. It's gone on for hundreds of years, and elsewhere in the world, parties just come and go. But our parties, I mean, the party I studied, the Democratic Party, is back to 1828. It's the oldest existing political party still operating in the world. And people also said, this historical perspective makes it sound so optimistic. It's so hard to be optimistic. And I guess my only answer to that is what Evan said a moment ago. That's what I think history does. It teaches you to think of the longue durée, right? The full span of the nation's existence and not to be locked in the present tense. It is a tonic. And so sometimes people will see that my answers to things are different than other people's answers because I'm giving an answer based on 250 years, not on the present day. So someone in that talk asked me a question, was surprised by my answer. And I said, but I'm not answering based on the year 2026. I'm giving you an answer based on 1828 to 2026. And here is the answer of that totality of years, right? Not just the present day. So, my own advisor, Drew Faust, used to call this the stranglehold of the present. How do you get rid of your present mindedness and the narcissism of the present, the subjectivity of the present? It's about us because we happen to be alive today. So history is a great field for sort of getting out get out of that. And then lastly, yeah, Bob is obviously correct. The principles are being taken apart. Do they have any meaning today? In what way are they being deployed? It's one of the most dangerous things to have the words and the concepts, the forms and the institutions around, but the substance and the spirit taken out of them. If you look at the collapse of the Roman Republic, it didn't happen by somebody like the Emperor Augustus saying, there shall not be any republic anymore. It happened very subtly, the form still existing. Here's a Senate, here's a this, here's a that, but it didn't mean anything anymore. It was just a sort of mirage, basically, right? And so the forms and the words are still there, but the spirit is not there. And the reason I'm saying this is because it all comes back to something else the founders knew full well. It is the spirit of the people that keeps the forms and the institutions and the words alive. So it all comes back to education, to having events like this for younger people in schools especially. Understanding civics is not just memorizing the things that sometimes people are taught, but this kind of thing, how do we have constructive conversation? How do we really think about the essence of our society? The education piece is what will ensure that future generations, that the forms and the institutions still have life to them. Going quickly here to Michael's question about empiricism, or I guess I would say rationalism and romanticism. Yes, I certainly agree. We are living in a moment of emotion rather than rationality. The last moment when we had rationality as sort of the regnant tone of our public discourse might have been the sort of progressive reform era, maybe the sort of Manhattan Project era of World War II, but perhaps not since then. The feeling is the key, and the way that we make arguments in our civic life today is kind of like the moral suasion approach of people in the antebellum era before the Civil War, where you tug at people's heartstrings. You make them cry to persuade them of something. You don't seek to persuade them like the founders did in their generation using rational means. And it's certainly something that I, as a scholar and a teacher, struggle with all the time when people come into the classroom. Well, I feel this way. I have to gently correct them. And I said, I appreciate your feelings, but in this particular setting at a university, we're here to analyze. What do you think about it? I understand how it makes you feel, but what do you think about it? So I think that kind of recalibration, might in fact be necessary. I think that's right.
One thing, what you just said kind of reminded me of, and, in our society today, and I think in a romantic society, the quote unquote elites are looked down upon. The elites are attacked. And that's, you hear that very commonly. I mean, you heard that a lot in COVID. This, the sort of elite doctors and elite telling us what to do. This kind of runs through. I mean, Richard Hofstadter, the anti-intellectual straight. So, but our revolution was essentially led by the elites. and so I think that kind of created a certain kind of moderation. And we live in a kind of anti-elite age one could say Trump, in some ways, is an elitist who plays an anti-elitist. So everything is they're who is an elitist and who is not an elitist is constantly changing because in some ways celebrities replace elitists. So I think you can trace a lot of those parallels. Um, okay, but that's a whole nother conversation. I just wanted to
As I
ask you
often
one.
say,
Yeah,
I ask people, what other country do you know that was created by experts who were reading political philosophy
right.
in order to create the form of government?
Right. Now, this is sort of a little bit of an off the wall question, but I remember one of our professors, Jack Rakove, who's actually from Evanston. He went to
Right.
Evanston High School, and his son was also a good friend of ours. Used to say that I believe that his favorite founder was James Madison.
His alter
And I,
ego, as a matter of
yes,
fact.
so I want you to explain why that's true, but then I also want you to know and tell my congregants, I mean, who's your favorite founder and why?
Hmm. Yes, so the other great student of the historian at Harvard, Bernard Bailyn, whom I mentioned before, who was sort of the giant of them all. So one of his students was Gordon Wood, who got his PhD under Bailyn in 1964, and another one of his was Jack Rakove, now it's retired at Stanford, who was one of our professors in college at Stanford, who got his PhD also at Harvard under Bailyn, I think in 1975, and became the leading historian of originalism in terms of constitutional interpretation. What did the Constitution originally mean? Can you get to an original intent, which is such a big question for the Supreme Court, as you know, and current jurisprudence. And yeah, for him, Madison was his alter ego. And it's a really interesting thing to say for a professor, because to admire someone who was Madison a politician? Was he a philosopher? Was he a constitution writer? Was he a state national representative? Well, he was all of those things. And the fact that you could be all of those things is really remarkable, right? And so the fact that you could have a leader like that be the alter ego of a professor is really amazing. I sometimes ask students to think about the moments when we've had sort of experts or philosophers, dare not use the word philosopher king in the Oval Office. After the founding
What was
era,
so great about Madison that he truly admired?
yeah, so Madison was the genius of the Constitution, right? Madison was the one who wrote the words of the Constitution. He was the scribe and the mastermind of so many of the ideas, particularly federalism. Obviously, he worked with the 54 other delegates assembled that summer in Philadelphia in 1787, but Madison was the constitutional engineer. And so the classes Rakove taught were thinking like a constitution, engineering a constitution. Rakove was really preoccupied with how do you engineer a constitution, again, a basic form of government outside of congressional statutory law to last centuries, to last the test of time, right? He was absolutely obsessed with that. To your other question, I've always thought, and people don't even think of him as a founder per se, but Franklin. He gets short shrift, but Franklin
Such
was
a
a
genius.
diplomat, was a scientist, right? Big scientist. Was on many committees, including negotiating the peace treaty with Great Britain in 1783. Had his hand in sort of all the great public municipal institutions in Philadelphia, from hospitals to the University of Pennsylvania to the Library of Company of Philadelphia. He was sort of an urban booster and a municipal reformer before that became fashionable. He was a very practical
Yes.
founder, very easy for people today to approach. If you read his autobiography, if you read his almanac, if you read his pseudonymously published columns, his pseudonym I recall was Silence Do Good. He's funny, he's practical, he's witty, he's human, he's very approachable. He's sort of the opposite, according to the historian Joseph Ellis, of George Washington, who is on Mount Olympus, or he's chiseled on a mountain. You can't approach Washington. He's majestic. He's not human. Franklin is the opposite. He's human. John Adams has his human foibles and appears very human, but Franklin is the sort of easy access founder. So if you pick
Right.
up, the autobiography today, and just any biography of Franklin today, he seems very like someone you'd sort of befriend today, and yet for all of that, I think he will teach us a lot about what the founding moment was actually about in terms of making practical difference in people's lives, really thinking things through in a very gradual, rational way, making small changes behind the scenes that will benefit people in the future. So I pick Franklin.
Excellent.
You've given us a lot to think about. I know you understand Yasher Koach.
Thank you.
Really, it's so interesting. You're getting a lot of claps.
Yeah.
What it just is setting us off now, and maybe we can feel a little bit better that we're looking at the long picture, not
Oh,
the,
I hope so.
yeah. So, we thank you
Thank
and,
you, my friend.
and if
Thank
you're
you.
in Chicago, let us know.
Oh yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Thank you.
The collections of the senator I work on, Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Lincoln Douglas Debate Fame, are held at U of C at Regenstein Library. So I do occasionally find myself there, not so
Okay,
much
let us
anymore,
know.
but in my days
And
of
you should
administrative.
go see Obama's library.
Yes, yes, of course, of course. Another professor president, as we're talking about experts, right?
Yes.
I was there. I did a renewal of vows ceremony there last Saturday.
Oh,
I love the architecture. A lot of people don't like it. I love it, and it's incredible. It's
I
incredible.
can't
Yeah.
wait.
Yeah.
thank you all for
Yeah.
listening. It was really great to
All
be with you
right.
today. Happy
We'll
Thank
Fourth.
you.
see everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Happy 4th.
Happy Fourth.
Thanks, Jonathan. That was
Thank you. Thank
fantastic.
Thank you.
you.
Thank you.
Fantastic.